But
Godspeed.
let's talk about it. Let's try not to waste any time. This is just going to be a quickie podcast. We're going to do a more full version later in the week when we kind of have the full vision of what they're going to do, because I think we can all agree this is not what their roster is going to even look like in week 1. So let's just go down position by position. We'll make it very easy on ourselves. We start with the quarterback position. No real surprises here. Hendon Hooker stays on the NFI. Adrian Martinez gets waived. Nate Sudfeld gets placed on IR after allegedly tearing his ACL. So you got Jared Goff, you got Teddy Bridgewater. Anything you guys want to say about the quarterbacks before we move on to the more interesting ones?
I don't think so. I think that's pretty much what we expected, save the Sudfeld move to IR. I think most people figured he wasn't going to be part of the 53-man alignment. So this is basically, I think, what we expected more or less.
Yeah, I think the only thing I have to add is maybe it was interesting that, the Athletic reported that the Lions were reportedly in on Trey Lance, right?
Yeah.
And combine that with, like Eric said, if Nate Sudfeld doesn't go to the IR, like, are the Lions keeping 3 quarterbacks? Like, that's the only thing that, you combine the Lance news, you think about what unfortunately happened to Nate. Would they have done that? I don't know. Interesting thing to think about, but I guess we're on to bigger and better things, right?
Yeah, and maybe they're in the market for a third quarterback on the practice squad. Adrian Martinez could certainly come back, but you have to imagine they're gonna bring someone. They're gonna want a third quarterback that's healthy. Obviously, Hendon Hooker's not quite there yet, but we'll get there when we get there with the quarterbacks. Now, running backs. This one sent some shockwaves through the system, including myself, until I kind of sat with it for a second here. I think there's a fairly easy explanation, but they only keep 2. David Montgomery, Jahmyr Gibbs, and then Jason Kabinda, if you count him. But Craig Reynolds gets released, which is an important designation here. Jamar Jefferson waives with an injury designation. Benny Snell gets waived. Divine Ezigbo also gets waived. Or I think he was actually released. But Eric, do you want to explain what's going on here, assuming you agree with my theory here?
Yeah, so Craig Reynolds had a veteran contract, a 4th-year veteran contract, and it didn't have any guaranteed money. Therefore, when they released him, there wasn't any cap penalty. And oftentimes, we see injured players the Lions want to put him on IR. And like with Nate Sudfeld, putting him on IR before the 53-man is established ends Nate Sudfeld's season. So unless they reach an injury settlement, that's as a side note. So in order to get a player into a spot where they can return from injured reserve, they have to make the initial 53-man roster. 2 players that are injured are both defenders, Julian Akwara and Ife Melifonwu. And so it's possible one of those guys is injured enough that they need to go on to IR, but they need to make the initial 53 in order to get to that point where they can return. And then it would make sense that you sneak them through. You release a veteran who doesn't have a cap penalty. You place the injured player on IR, and then return the veteran on a new contract, and he's back on the roster, giving you 3 running backs. And so look, we've seen them do that before. Even last year, we kind of saw some roster gymnastics with Justin Jackson, right? So it's not uncommon for them to be creative with their running backs.
Yeah, and just to clarify really quick, you have to be a veteran to be able to release them rather than waive them. And right. So there's if the intention is on bringing Craig Reynolds back is what they're doing, they're going to pick someone that they can release, a veteran on this team, so that they can like whisper in his ear saying like, hey, we're cutting you, but you're coming right back as long as you're cool with it, with no risk to losing them for waivers. And you mentioned that the contract being no guarantees, that makes him a good candidate. Also, you just look at the guys that they released. There's only 8 of them. Everyone else is only eligible to get waived because this is such a young roster. So Benny Snell, Daryl Daniels, Christian Covington, Bobby Hart, Jermaine Ifedi, Jason Moore, Divine Ozigbo. Those are your 8 guys who were released, your veterans that were released. So amongst that group, it certainly seems like if they are going the IR route, Craig Reynolds is the first one back through the door.
Yeah, the old Darren Fells roster trick, right?
Yeah. That's right.
Yep.
Yeah, I think the one thing, the initial shock of it was like, oh man, what? Craig Reynolds is gone? Because he was clearly the Lions, best running back who played consistently in the preseason. But And that's saying something because he only played 2 games.
Yeah. Right. But he played almost the entire halves of both of those games, and I didn't ever get a sense his injury or his roster spot was really in danger. But they could be also looking to upgrade. We'll kind of see in the next 24 to 48 hours here. Let's move on to wide receiver. Not a ton of surprises here. The Lions keep Amon-Ra, Josh Reynolds, Khalif Raymond, Marvin Jones, Antoine Green, Chase Cota. A lot of people's kind of favorite amongst the undrafted guys. He gets waived with an injury settlement. So he was dealing with an injury that I didn't think we were too aware of. Maurice Alexander gets cut. Dylan Drummond, I guess, is maybe the guy to talk about here because he was a guy that was very consistent through training camp, but did get waived here. I'll go to you first this time, Ryan. Were you surprised by that one?
Maybe a surprise from the sense that, like, you're always rooting for the feel-good underdog story, and it just felt like Dylan Drummond just had so much good momentum going all the way back to May, right? Like one of 10 guys who gets invited to rookie minicamp. Not only does he make the cut, but he also like impressed people, right? Like there's a little bit of buzz about Dylan Drummond going into training camp, and then at the beginning of training camp, that buzz kind of sustained itself, and then it kind of faded in and out a little bit. But he ended on a high note, and I think it's always kind of recency bias with a lot of these players that don't end up making the 53, and you say, oh man, like he was great, how did he not make the team? I think that's kind of what happened with Craig Reynolds, right? Like he had such a dynamite game against Carolina where It's like, yeah, I think the Lions can trust that guy to be their RB3 in a pinch. But I think the same thing kind of happened with Drummond, because he definitely kind of ebbed and flowed his way through training camp, but ended on a high note, and it was just kind of a bummer to see the guy not stick in Detroit, but practice squad, right? Hopefully.
I think one of the things that we see consistently across this roster is guys that can, or positions that can have multiple players at it. The third guy at that role kind of becomes a little bit more vulnerable. And when roster spots are hard to come by, being the third slot receiver is a bit of an issue, because while Khalif may play on the outside a lot, and when he's in the slot, you may see Amon-Ra on the outside, they still have 2 guys in the pecking order ahead of where Drummond was. And so this is something Jeremy brought up after the Carolina game. He said, is it concerning, or you brought up the fact that he plays the slot, and if that could be a hindrance to him. And I said I didn't think it would, because of how he fit into how they played, but we see that carry over at multiple spots, where if you have a guy who can play and back up a position where you already have an established starter, do you need a third guy? And we're seeing a lot of no's, especially on offense.
Yeah. The only thing I would add to this discussion is like it's important to remember how far he's come. He's a guy that wasn't drafted, wasn't a priority UDFA for anybody, didn't get signed on draft weekend. So I think the Lions are probably thinking like, this is our guy. Like no one else. He's not even on anybody else's roster or mind, right? Like this is the guy that we found in our local pro day. We found in our rookie minicamp, and so he's not going to be really on anyone else's radar. Maybe the Giants, maybe the Jaguars, because they were in town and they saw him, but at the same time, the Jaguars have a pretty deep bench of wide receivers, and the Giants kind of do too. So I think there's very little risk in putting him up to waivers, even if other GMs are reading the news clippings here in Detroit and all that. I think pretty fair chance he goes through the waiver wire, and I have to imagine he's going to be a priority re-signing to the practice squad here.
What's going on, guys? Miko here from Pride of Detroit. Thanks for taking the time to check out this clip from our most recent POD live stream. If you enjoyed this video and you want to see where the conversation went from here, all you have to do is click the link in the description that'll take you over to our Twitch channel. And once you're on our Twitch channel, be sure to drop us a follow or subscribe if you're so inclined. That way you can be notified anytime we go live and be a part of our live audience, which means that you may be privy to content that doesn't always make it onto the audio version of the podcast or even onto YouTube. Also, if you're more inclined and you prefer an audio version of our live streams, you can click the links to both Spotify or Apple Music, which will take you to their platform, and you can download the entire audio version of the podcast and listen to it whenever you want to. Again, we appreciate you guys and thank you for the support. Be sure to leave a like, a comment, and subscribe to this channel if you're new, and we will be sure to keep bringing you amazing Lions content.